Carolyn Hudson was cleaning the attic when she found the box. It was an ordinary Saturday in April, their 35th wedding anniversary approaching, and she'd finally decided to tackle the clutter that had accumulated over decades in their suburban Chicago home. The leather-bound box was tucked behind an old suitcase, partially hidden beneath the eaves. She didn't recognize it as something she'd stored, which was strange, since Carolyn prided herself on knowing the location of every family possession. It was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom, as if someone wanted it secured, yet accessible. Her husband Thomas was golfing, as he did every Saturday morning, weather permitting. 35 years of marriage had established their comfortable routines, his golf, her gardening, Sunday dinners with their grown children when possible. A life built on constancy and trust. She turned the small key in the lock, expecting old financial documents or perhaps family mementos Thomas had saved. Inside was a stack of letters bound with a faded blue ribbon. They were addressed to Thomas, but the name that followed wasn't Hudson. The envelopes were addressed to Thomas Caldwell. Carolyn frowned. Her husband's name was Thomas Hudson. Always had been. With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The handwriting was feminine, flowing across the yellowed paper. The date at the top read June 15th, 1982, 6 months before she'd met Thomas. "My dearest Thomas," it began, "the doctors say there's nothing more they can do. I've made peace with what's coming, but there's something you must know. Emily isn't Roger's daughter. She's yours." Carolyn's breath caught. She flipped the letter over, scanning for the signature. "All my love forever, Claire." The attic suddenly felt airless. Thomas had no sister named Claire, no cousin or aunt by that name either. And Emily? Who was Emily? Carolyn reached for the next letter with shaking hands, her world beginning to tilt on its axis. 35 years of marriage, and now this, evidence of another name, another life, and apparently a child she'd never known existed. Carolyn sat cross-legged on the attic floor, surrounded by the letters. She'd read through all 12 of them, each revealing another piece of a life she'd never known existed. The narrative they painted was both clear and incomprehensible. Thomas, her Thomas, had once been Thomas Caldwell. He had been involved with a woman named Claire, who had apparently died of cancer in the early 1980s, and they had a daughter named Emily. Her hands trembled as she carefully returned the letters to their envelopes, preserving the chronological order. The final letter, dated October 1982, just weeks before she'd met Thomas at a friend's Christmas party, was the most devastating. In it, Claire wrote about arrangements for Emily to live with her sister and brother-in-law after her death, expressing hope that someday Thomas would find the courage to claim his daughter. "She has your eyes," Claire had written. "Every time she looks at me, I see you looking back." Carolyn tried to reconcile these revelations with the man she'd known and loved for 35 years. Thomas Hudson, kind, reliable, sometimes frustratingly predictable Thomas, the high school history teacher who had never missed a parent-teacher conference for their own 2 children, who remembered every anniversary with thoughtful gifts, who coached Little League and volunteered at the food bank every Thanksgiving. How could this steadfast man have abandoned his own child? How could he have hidden an entire identity, a whole life, from her for over 3 decades? Carolyn glanced at her watch. Thomas would be home in less than an hour. She needed time to think, to decide how to confront him. She carefully returned the letters to the box, locked it, and carried it downstairs to their bedroom, hiding it in her side of the closet behind winter sweaters. In the kitchen, she mechanically prepared lunch, her mind replaying snippets of their life together, searching for clues she might have missed. There had been that reluctance to visit Boston, where Claire's letters had been postmarked from. His discomfort when their daughter Jessica had wanted to trace their genealogy for a school project years ago. The way he sometimes grew quiet on certain dates. Could one of them have been Claire's death anniversary or Emily's birthday? The sound of the garage door opening sent a jolt of adrenaline through her body. She wiped her damp palms on her jeans and took a deep breath. Should she confront him immediately? Or wait, perhaps do some investigating on her own first? "Something smells good," Thomas called as he entered the kitchen, setting his golf bag by the door. At 62, he was still handsome. Silver hair where it had once been dark brown, laugh lines etched around eyes that had always reminded her of a calm sea. The eyes that, according to Claire's letter, Emily had inherited. "Just sandwiches," Carolyn replied, amazed at how normal her voice sounded. "How was golf?" "Jim beat me by 2 strokes, but I'll get him next week." Thomas washed his hands at the sink, then moved behind her, placing a kiss on her neck, a familiar gesture from thousands of ordinary days. "How's the attic coming along?" Something in his tone made her glance up sharply. Did he know what she'd found? Was there anxiety beneath the casual question? But his expression remained relaxed, open. "Slow progress," she said carefully. "Found some interesting things tucked away." "Oh?" He reached for a sandwich half, seemingly unconcerned. "Anything important?" The moment stretched between them, a precipice Carolyn wasn't quite ready to leap from. Once the words were spoken, there would be no going back. Their marriage, their entire history together would be forever altered. "Just old photographs, mostly," she lied, hating how easily the deception came. Was this how it had been for him all these years? These small, seemingly harmless omissions that protected a much larger secret? They ate lunch together, making plans for the coming week, discussing their son Michael's upcoming visit with their grandchildren. The normality was surreal, a familiar domestic scene now playing out against the backdrop of Carolyn's terrible knowledge. Thomas seemed completely at ease, unaware that the foundation of their life together had just cracked beneath Carolyn's feet. After lunch, Thomas settled in the den to watch a baseball game, and Carolyn retreated to their home office, closing the door behind her. Her hands shook slightly as she opened her laptop and typed "Thomas Caldwell, Boston, 1982" into the search bar. Nothing useful appeared. Too many Thomas Caldwells, too many decades passed for digital footprints. She tried various combinations, adding Claire's name, searching for death notices or obituaries from that period. Finally, a promising lead. A digitized newspaper article from the Boston Herald, November 1982, mentioning the death of Claire Elizabeth Whitman, age 30, survived by her daughter Emily and sister Catherine Whitman Richards. Carolyn's heart pounded as she stared at the grainy image. The article was brief, with no photo, but it aligned perfectly with the timeline in the letters. This was real. Claire had been real. Emily was real. She opened a new tab and searched for Catherine Richards, Boston. Several results appeared, including a Facebook profile for a Catherine Richards, now in her 70s, still living in Cambridge. Carolyn clicked through to the profile, which was partially public. There were pictures of an older woman with silver hair, her arms around younger people at various gatherings, children and grandchildren, presumably, and then she saw her, a woman in her early 40s with Thomas's eyes, unmistakably his eyes, smiling at the camera from a family gathering photo captioned Emily's 40th birthday. Carolyn zoomed in, studying the face that shared features with both the woman from the obituary and with the man currently watching baseball in their den. There was no doubt this was Thomas's daughter. A notification sound from her phone broke her concentration. It was a text from their daughter Jessica. "Just checking final. Details for the anniversary party next weekend. Can you talk?" The anniversary party, their 35th wedding anniversary, which their children had been planning for months. A celebration of a marriage built on what Carolyn had always believed was an unshakable foundation of honesty and trust. She closed the laptop slowly, trying to steady her breathing. She needed more information before confronting Thomas, needed to understand the full scope of his deception. The party was still a week away. She had time to investigate, to decide how to proceed. "Everything okay?" Thomas asked when she emerged from the office an hour later. He looked up from his game, concerned by whatever he saw in her expression. "You look pale." "Just a headache," she replied, the second lie of the day coming as easily as the first. "Think I'll lie down for a bit." In their bedroom, Carolyn curled on her side of the bed, facing away from the door. She could hear the faint sounds of the baseball game downstairs, the familiar rhythm of their Saturday afternoon. Outside, a lawnmower droned somewhere down the street, life continuing as it always had, while inside, her world was collapsing. She thought about the letters hidden in her closet, about the daughter Thomas had never acknowledged, about the 35 years of marriage suddenly cast in shadow. What else had he hidden from her? What kind of man was capable of abandoning his child, changing his name, and building an entirely new life with no apparent remorse? And what kind of woman was she, now lying to the husband she'd promised always to be honest with? "We're more alike than I thought, Thomas," she whispered to the empty room. "We both know how to keep secrets now." As the afternoon light slanted through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the bed they'd shared for over 3 decades, Carolyn made a decision. She would continue her investigation quietly. She would find Emily, would learn the truth about Thomas Caldwell before confronting Thomas Hudson with his past. The man she had married deserved a chance to explain himself. But first, she needed to know exactly what he would be explaining. With that resolution made, Carolyn dried her tears and reached for her phone. She needed to respond to Jessica about the anniversary party, a celebration that might now become something entirely different from what any of them had planned. Sunday passed in a fog of pretense. Carolyn moved through their usual routines. Church in the morning, brunch at their favorite diner, an afternoon of gardening while Thomas read on the patio. Every interaction felt like a performance, her smiles carefully controlled, her casual questions concealing the turmoil beneath. Monday brought relief as Thomas returned to the high school where he'd taught history for nearly 30 years. Alone. In the house, Carolyn retrieved the box of letters from her closet and spread them across the bed, rereading passages, searching for any details she might have missed. She created a timeline on a legal pad. 1980-1982, Thomas Caldwell in relationship with Claire Whitman in Boston Fall. 1982, Claire dies of cancer, leaving daughter Emily with her sister Catherine, December 1982. Thomas moves to Chicago, changes name to Hudson, January 1983. Thomas meets Carolyn at New Year's party. June 1984, Thomas and Carolyn marry in 1986, birth of their son. Michael, 1988, birth of their daughter. Jessica, Carolyn stared at the stark chronology. Barely 2 months between Claire's death and Thomas's appearance in Chicago. Had he planned this transformation, or was it a panicked flight from responsibility? And why change his name? What was he hiding from, beyond the obligation of fatherhood? She picked up her phone, then set it down again. Contacting Emily directly seemed too abrupt, too potentially devastating. Better to start with Claire's sister, Catherine, the woman who had raised Thomas's abandoned daughter, using the information. From Catherine's Facebook profile, Carolyn found a landline number listed in Cambridge. Her heart pounded as she dialed, uncertain what she would say. "Hello?" A woman's voice, warm but cautious. "Is this Catherine Richards?" Carolyn asked, her mouth suddenly dry. "Yes? Who's calling, please?" Carolyn hesitated. "My name is Carolyn Hudson. I believe you knew someone named Thomas Caldwell many years ago." The silence that followed was profound. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice had cooled noticeably. How did you get this number? What is this about? I found letters, Carolyn said, deciding that directness was the only approach. Letters from Claire to Thomas. I'm Thomas's wife. Another lengthy silence. Then, Thomas Caldwell has a wife. Yes, Carolyn confirmed. Me. For 35 years now, except I know him as Thomas Hudson. A sharp intake of breath. He changed. His name. Apparently so, Carolyn said, fighting to keep her voice steady. I only discovered this 2 days ago. I found letters from Claire about Emily. I need to understand what happened. Where is he now? Does he know you're calling me? Catherine's questions came rapidly. He's at work. And no, he doesn't know. Carolyn swallowed hard. I haven't confronted him yet. I wanted to learn the truth first. Catherine sighed heavily. The truth after all these years. She paused. This isn't a conversation for the telephone. If you want the full story, you'll need to come to Boston. I can do that, Carolyn said, surprising herself with the immediate commitment. I can fly out tomorrow. They arranged to meet the following afternoon at Catherine's home in Cambridge. After hanging up, Carolyn sat motionless, absorbing the reality that she was now actively investigating her husband's past behind his back. The irony wasn't lost on her. Secrecy begetting secrecy. She booked a flight to Boston, departing early the next morning, then crafted a careful lie about visiting her college roommate Diane in New York City for a couple of days to help plan their upcoming class reunion. Thomas accepted the explanation without question, even encouraging her to enjoy the break. You've been looking tired lately, he said over dinner, concern evident in his eyes. A change of scenery will do you good. Carolyn nodded, wondering if he noticed how she avoided meeting his gaze. It's just for 2 nights. I'll be back Thursday. That night, lying beside him in the darkness, Carolyn studied the familiar profile of her husband's face in repose. The man she'd shared a bed with for 3.5 decades. The father of her children, a man who had apparently abandoned his first child and constructed an entirely new identity. Who are you? She whispered, too softly to wake him. Tuesday morning, Carolyn kissed Thomas goodbye as he left for work, then quickly packed an overnight bag and called a rideshare to O'Hare. By noon, she was in the air, watching Chicago recede beneath clouds, heading toward a past her husband had left behind 40 years ago. Catherine's home in Cambridge was a well-maintained Victorian, shaded by mature maple trees just beginning to leaf out in the early spring warmth. Carolyn paused at the gate, momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was doing. Inside this house, she would learn truths that might destroy her marriage, her family, everything she had built her life upon. Before she could reconsider, the front door opened. An elegant woman with silver hair stood on the porch, watching her with eyes that held both wariness and compassion. "Carolyn," she called, "please, come in." Catherine Richards was 74, a retired literature professor with the precise speech and steady gaze of someone accustomed to classroom authority. She led Carolyn to a sunlit sitting room and poured tea from a waiting pot. "I've been thinking about this meeting since your call," Catherine said, settling into an armchair. "Wondering what to tell you, how much you need to know." "Everything," Carolyn said simply. "I need to know everything." Catherine nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. "Thomas Caldwell was my brother-in-law, not by marriage. Claire and Thomas never married. But he was the love of my sister's life." She set down her teacup. "And the father of her child, though he refused to acknowledge Emily publicly." "Why?" Carolyn asked, the question that had haunted her since finding the letters. "Ambition primarily," Catherine replied. "Thomas was an aspiring politician back then, working on Governor King's staff. He had aspirations for his own career in politics. An illegitimate child with a woman he wasn't married to. It would have complicated his image. Carolyn tried to reconcile this description with the high school teacher she'd married, a man who had shown little interest in politics beyond voting regularly and occasionally writing letters to his congressman. When Claire was diagnosed with cancer, she was already 5 months pregnant, Catherine continued. Thomas urged her to terminate the pregnancy to focus on her treatment, but Claire refused. She wanted that baby, wanted to leave something of herself in the world. Catherine's eyes grew distant with memory. Emily was born healthy, thankfully. Claire had 2 years with her daughter before the cancer returned. And Thomas, he visited, occasionally, provided some financial support, but quietly, always concerned about protecting his reputation. When Claire's condition worsened, she begged him to take responsibility for Emily after she was gone. He wouldn't commit. Catherine's mouth tightened. The last time I saw Thomas Caldwell was at my sister's funeral. He left immediately after the service, didn't even stay for the reception. A week later, when I tried to contact him about arrangements for Emily, he had vanished. His apartment emptied, his position at the governor's office resigned, no forwarding address. And he came to Chicago, Carolyn murmured. Became Thomas Hudson. Apparently so. Catherine studied Carolyn with a penetrating gaze. You truly had no idea for 35 years. Carolyn shook her head, feeling the sting of tears. None. He created an entirely new past. Told me he was from Seattle originally, that his parents had died in a car accident when he was in college, that he had no siblings. She wiped at her eyes. I never questioned it, never had reason to. And now you're questioning everything, Catherine observed quietly. Yes. Carolyn looked up. Emily, how is she? What does she know about her father? Emily is wonderful. Married, 2 children of her own, works as a pediatric nurse. She knows that. Her father was unwilling or unable to raise her, but Claire never spoke ill of him to her daughter. I've honored that, though there have been times. Catherine shook her head. Emily has wondered about him over the years, of course, especially when she became a parent herself. Does she know his name? Has she tried to find him? She knows. He was Thomas Caldwell. She did some searching in her 20s but found nothing, assumed he might have died or moved abroad. Catherine leaned forward. Does your husband know about your discovery? No, Carolyn admitted. Our 35th anniversary is next weekend. Our children have planned a big celebration. I wanted to understand what I'm dealing with before confronting him. Catherine nodded, slowly. And now that you're beginning to understand, what will you do? The question hung in the air between them. Carolyn had been asking herself the same thing since finding the letters, with no clear answer. I don't know, she said, honestly. I love the man I married. We've built a life together, raised children, have grandchildren now, but this deception, it's fundamental. And there's Emily, his daughter who grew up without a father. A decision that can't be unmade, Catherine said softly. Carolyn hesitated. Would Emily want to know that he's alive, that I've found him? Catherine considered the question carefully. I can't answer that with certainty. It would be a profound shock, learning her father has been living another life, has other children, that he chose them over her. She met Carolyn's gaze directly. But I believe people deserve the truth, however painful. Emily is strong. She has built a good life without Thomas Caldwell. Knowledge of his existence might hurt her, but not knowing, being denied the choice, that's its own kind of harm. Carolyn nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Could I meet her? Before I decide what to do about Thomas. She's working today, Catherine said, but she's coming for dinner tomorrow evening with her family. I could call, explain the situation, see if she's willing to meet. You, please, Carolyn said. I need to see her, to understand what Thomas left behind before I confront what he built with me. As she left Catherine's house an hour later, Carolyn felt both burdened and strangely liberated. The woman had shared photographs of Claire and Emily through the years: school portraits, graduation, Emily's wedding. The physical resemblance to Thomas was subtle but unmistakable, especially around the eyes and in certain expressions. In her hotel room that evening, Carolyn spread the photographs across the bed, alongside prints of their own family pictures she'd brought from home. She stared at the parallel lives Thomas had created and abandoned, the daughter he'd never acknowledged alongside the children he'd raised with devotion. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "How's Diane? Weather good in New York?" Another lie to navigate, another deception layered upon deception. She responded vaguely about catching up with old friends, then set the phone aside, unable to maintain the pretense of normal conversation. Tomorrow she would meet Emily, the daughter Thomas had abandoned, the half-sister her children never knew existed. And then she would have to decide whether to shatter the foundation of the life she had built with a man who, she was beginning to understand, might be a stranger after all. Carolyn spent Wednesday morning walking the streets of Boston, trying to imagine Thomas here 4 decades earlier, young, ambitious, facing the crisis of an ill partner and unwanted child. What had gone through his mind as he'd made the decision to abandon everything and start anew? Had it been a momentary act of cowardice that snowballed, or a calculated choice to reinvent himself? She found herself on the Boston Common, watching mothers with strollers, nannies shepherding toddlers, the everyday rhythms of family life continuing around her while her own understanding of family was fracturing. Her phone buzzed. A text from Catherine. "Emily has agreed to meet you. Dinner at my house, 6 p.m. Just Emily first, without her husband and children. She needs time to process this." Carolyn texted back her thanks, then sat heavily on a park bench. This was really happening. In a few hours she would meet her husband's firstborn child, the daughter he had never acknowledged, whose existence he had hidden for their entire marriage. Back at her hotel, she changed clothes 3 times, unsure how to dress for such an unprecedented encounter. What impression did she want to make on Emily? She wasn't the villain in this story, but neither was she free from complicity. She had benefited from Thomas's new life, however unknowingly. She finally settled on a simple navy dress, conservative but not stiff, approachable without being casual. As she applied her makeup, Carolyn studied her reflection. At 60, her face showed the expected lines of a life well lived, but her eyes held a new wariness that aging alone couldn't explain. "Who are you now?" she asked her reflection. "Who will you be after tonight?" Catherine answered the door at precisely 6 o'clock, her expression a careful neutral. "Emily arrived a few minutes ago," she said quietly. "She's in the sitting room. She's, nervous." "That makes 2 of us," Carolyn replied, handing over the bottle of wine she'd brought, a social nicety that felt absurdly inadequate for the occasion. The woman waiting in Catherine's sitting room stood as Carolyn entered. She was tall and slender, with chestnut hair cut in a practical bob and eyes that were unmistakably Thomas's. The same deep blue, the same slight crinkle at the corners. She wore scrubs beneath a light cardigan, having come directly from her shift at the hospital. "Emily," Carolyn said, her voice catching, "thank you for agreeing to meet me." Emily nodded stiffly, not offering her hand. Aunt Catherine explained, "Who you are? Thomas Caldwell's wife." "His second wife, it seems," Carolyn corrected gently, "though I only learned that 3 days ago." The 3 women sat, an uncomfortable triangle of shared connection to a man who wasn't present. Catherine poured wine, the ritual providing a momentary relief from the tension. "I don't know where to begin," Carolyn admitted, after taking a fortifying sip. "Begin with why you're here," Emily suggested. her professional calm belied by the tight grip on her wine glass. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Carolyn said quickly. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm here because—" She hesitated. "Because I needed to see you. To understand what Thomas left behind when he became the man I married." Emily's expression flickered with something complex: pain, curiosity, anger. "And what kind of man did you marry? What did Thomas Caldwell become after he abandoned his dying girlfriend and their baby?" The question wasn't asked with obvious bitterness, but Carolyn felt its sharp edges nonetheless. "He became a high school history teacher, a dedicated father to our 2 children, a dependable husband." She met Emily's gaze directly. "A good man, I thought. Good men don't abandon their children," Emily said quietly. "No," Carolyn agreed. "They don't." An uncomfortable silence fell. Catherine excused herself to check on dinner, leaving the 2 women alone. "I have questions," Emily said finally. "Things I've wondered about my whole life." "I'll answer what I can," Carolyn offered, "though I'm still searching for answers myself." Emily leaned forward slightly. "Did he ever mention my mother? Or me? Even in passing?" Carolyn shook her head. "Never. As far as I knew until Saturday, Thomas had no previous serious relationships, no children before ours. He told me he was from Seattle, that his parents died in an accident during his college years." "All lies," Emily observed. "Yes." The simple admission hung in the air between them. "What is he like?" Emily asked after a moment. "As a father, I mean." The question sent a pang through Carolyn's heart. "Attentive, involved. He coached our son's baseball team, never missed our daughter's dance recitals. He taught them to drive, helped with homework, gave advice about college." She paused, aware of how each detail might wound the woman across from her. "He's been a constant presence in their lives." Emily nodded, her expression carefully controlled. "Just not in mine." "No," Carolyn acknowledged, "not in yours." "Do your children know about me?" "No. No one in our life knows. I haven't told Thomas that I've discovered his past. Our 35th anniversary is this weekend. Our children have planned a celebration." Carolyn ran a finger around the rim of her glass. "I wanted to understand the full picture before deciding what to do." Emily studied her with those familiar blue eyes. "And now that you've met me, what will you do?" "I don't know," Carolyn admitted. "Confront him, certainly. But beyond that—" She shook her head. "I've been asking myself if this deception negates everything we've built together. If the man I've loved for 35 years even exists." "He exists," Emily said, surprising Carolyn with the certainty in her voice. "He's just not who you thought he was." She set down her glass. "I've had to accept that my father chose not to be in my life. I've made peace with that, built my own family, my own identity. But I've always wondered why. Why he couldn't love me enough to stay." Carolyn felt tears threatening. "I don't think it was about you," she said softly. "From what Catherine told me, it seems he was ambitious, worried about his political future, perhaps too immature to handle the responsibility." "Perhaps," Emily acknowledged, "but knowing that doesn't fill the empty space he left." Catherine returned, announcing dinner was ready. The conversation over the meal shifted to less painful topics: Emily's work as a pediatric nurse, her children, her husband who taught engineering at MIT. Carolyn shared stories of her own children, carefully editing out Thomas's presence in the anecdotes. As the evening drew to a close, Emily walked Carolyn to the door while Catherine cleared the table. "Will you tell him about meeting me?" Emily asked. Carolyn nodded. "Yes, he needs to know that I know everything." "And will you tell your children that they have a half-sister?" "I think they deserve the truth," Carolyn said. "But I need to talk to Thomas first. This affects all of us, but it's his deception to answer for." Emily hesitated, then asked the question that Carolyn had been dreading. Would you tell him? Would you tell him I might be willing to meet him? Not now, not soon, but someday, perhaps. Carolyn felt a complicated surge of emotion, gratitude for Emily's grace, apprehension about Thomas's reaction, uncertainty about their future. I'll tell him, she promised, as her rideshare pulled away. From Catherine's house, Carolyn realized she was returning to Chicago with far more questions than answers. She had met the daughter Thomas had abandoned, had glimpsed the life he had fled, but understanding why he had done it and what it meant for their marriage remained elusive. Tomorrow she would fly home to confront the man who had lived a double life for longer than she had known him, the man whose secrets now threatened everything they had built together. Thomas was grading papers at the dining room table when Carolyn arrived home Thursday evening. He glanced up with a warm smile that once would have melted her heart, but now only intensified her sense of betrayal. "Welcome home," he said, rising to embrace her. "How was New York? How's Diane?" The casual questions about her fictitious trip hung in the air as Carolyn stiffened in his arms. The practiced lies, the easy deception. She recognized them now from the other side. "I wasn't in New York," she said, stepping back from his embrace. "And I didn't see Diane." Thomas's expression shifted, confusion replacing warmth. "What? Where were you then?" "Boston." Carolyn watched his face closely, saw the flicker of alarm in his eyes before he could mask it. "I was in Boston, Thomas. Or should I call you Thomas Caldwell?" The color drained from his face. He sank back into his chair, papers forgotten. "How did you—" "I found the box in the attic," Carolyn said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The letters from Claire about Emily." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing a physical blow. When he opened them, the familiar blue was clouded with an emotion Carolyn couldn't quite identify, fear, perhaps, or resignation. "I can explain," he began. "Can you—" Carolyn interrupted, anger suddenly surging through her practiced calm. "Can you explain abandoning your child when her mother was dying? Can you explain changing your name, creating a false past, lying to me for 35 years? Please, Thomas, explain that." She set her overnight bag on the floor and took the chair opposite him, the dining table between them like a negotiation table. The distance felt necessary. She didn't trust herself to be closer. Thomas ran a hand through his silver hair, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache, despite everything. "I don't know where to start," he said finally. "Start with who you really are," Carolyn said, "because I'm not sure I ever knew." He nodded, shoulders slumping. "My name was Thomas Caldwell. I grew up in New Hampshire, not Seattle. My parents didn't die in a car accident. They divorced when I was 12. My father died of a heart attack in 1990, my mother in 2005. "Did you attend their funerals?" Carolyn asked, remembering business trips that had taken Thomas away around those times. His eyes flickered with surprise at her perception. "Yes, I told you they were academic conferences." "More lies," Carolyn noted. "Did you ever stop lying?" "To me, Thomas, the important things weren't lies," he said, leaning forward intently. "My love for you, for our children, that's always been real. And Claire, was your love for her real? And Emily, how could you abandon your own child?" Thomas flinched at the names. "You've been investigating." "Yes," Carolyn confirmed. "I went to Boston to meet Catherine Richards and Emily." "You met Emily?" Thomas paled further, his hands gripping the edge of the table. My daughter?" "Yes, your daughter, the one you've never acknowledged, never supported, never even mentioned in 35 years of marriage." Carolyn's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain control. "She has your eyes, Thomas, exactly your eyes. How could you leave her?" Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back, agitation visible in every movement. "It wasn't that," Simple. Then explain it to me, Carolyn demanded. Make me understand how the man I married could do something so unforgivable. He sank back into his chair, the fight seeming to drain out of him. I was 26 when I met Claire, working for Governor King, ambitious, focused entirely on my career. Claire was a complication, beautiful, brilliant, but not part of my plan. A complication, Carolyn repeated, the clinical term for a love affair, a child, a human life making her stomach turn. When she got pregnant, I panicked, Thomas continued, his gaze fixed on the table between them. I wasn't ready for a family, for that responsibility. I offered to pay for an abortion, which she refused. He nodded. She wanted the baby, with or without me. I'd compromised, provided financial support, visited occasionally, but kept our relationship quiet. My career was taking off. There was talk of grooming me for a congressional run. An illegitimate child would have complicated that. And then Claire got sick, Carolyn prompted when he fell silent. Cancer, Thomas confirmed, pain flashing across his features. Advanced by the time they found it. Emily was barely a year old. He swallowed hard. Claire wanted me to take Emily when she died, to be a real father, to raise our daughter. But you didn't want that kind of complication either, Carolyn said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Thomas looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since her revelation. I was a coward, he admitted. I told Claire I would take Emily, promised her I would, but after the funeral, facing the reality of raising a child alone, of explaining her to my colleagues, my political contacts, he shook his head. I ran, left everything behind, started over where no one knew me. You abandoned your child, Carolyn stated flatly. Let her grow up without a father. Yes. The simple admission hung between them. Catherine contacted me once, about a month after I'd moved to Chicago, found me through a mutual friend. She was furious, threatened to expose me, to ruin whatever new life I was building. Why didn't she? For Emily's sake. She didn't want the child growing up with a public scandal attached to her name. She said if I stayed away completely, no half measures, no occasional visits that would only confuse Emily, she would keep my secret, for Emily's sake, not mine. Carolyn absorbed this information, picturing Catherine's protective fierceness. Did you ever check on her? Ever wonder how she was doing? Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Every year on her birthday, I would call Catherine's number just to listen to the answering machine, to hear if there was any mention of Emily in the greeting. I never spoke, never left a message, just needed to know she was there, that she was okay. The admission was both touching and disturbing, evidence that he had never completely forgotten his first child, yet had still chosen to remain absent from her life. And when did you decide to create an entirely new identity, to become Thomas Hudson with a fictional past? Almost immediately, he admitted. I knew I might be searched for, that my political connections might make my disappearance noteworthy. I had a college friend who worked in records administration. He helped me create a new paper trail, birth certificate, social security number, the basics, the rest I built over time. And you never thought to tell me? In 35 years of marriage, it never occurred to you that I deserved to know who I had really married. At first I thought I might tell you eventually, Thomas said, his voice lowering, after we'd dated a while if things got serious. But then we were engaged, and I worried you might leave me if you knew. Then we were married, had children, and the lie was too big, had gone on too long. He looked at her pleadingly. How could I tell you then? Risk losing everything we'd built together? So instead you let me live a lie. Carolyn shook her head, a deep weariness settling into her bones. All these years, all these memories, tainted now. Not tainted, Thomas insisted, reaching for Her hand across the table, she pulled back from his touch. Carolyn, the life we built together is real. The man you married, that's the real me. Thomas Hudson is who I truly became. After running from who you were, she countered. After abandoning your responsibilities, your child. Thomas flinched at the repeated accusation but didn't deny it. Yes, I've lived with that knowledge, that guilt, every day for 40 years. Not enough guilt to contact her, to support her, to acknowledge her existence. I convinced myself she was better off without me, he said quietly. That a clean break was kinder than a part-time, reluctant father. And later, when I had Michael and Jessica, I told myself it would be too disruptive to their lives to suddenly introduce a half-sister to explain my past. Convenient justifications, Carolyn observed coldly. They sat in heavy silence, the weight of decades of deception pressing down between them. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, a car door slammed, normal life continuing while theirs imploded. What happens now? Thomas finally asked, his voice small. It was the question Carolyn had been asking herself since finding the letters through her investigation in Boston on the flight home. What did happen now? How did a marriage of 35 years recover? From a lie this fundamental, I don't know, she answered honestly. I've been trying to separate the deception from the life we've built, to decide if the man I've loved all these years is real, despite the lies. She stood, needing to move, to create space between them. But there's something else we need to discuss. What? Thomas looked up, apprehension clear in his expression. Our children, Michael and Jessica, the anniversary party this weekend. Thomas paled. You haven't told them? Not yet, Carolyn confirmed, but they deserve to know the truth, about who their father really is, about their half-sister. Carolyn, please, Thomas began, rising from his chair. Think about what this will do to them. I have thought about it, she said sharply. I've thought about little else. But they're adults, Thomas. They have a right to know their true family history. To know they have a sister. Half-sister, Thomas corrected automatically. Sister, Carolyn insisted. Emily is their sister, your daughter their sibling. The fact that you've hidden her existence doesn't change that biological reality. Thomas sank back into his chair, defeat evident in every line of his body. And what about us? He asked. Our marriage? It was the question Carolyn had been circling since the moment she'd opened that first letter. Did this deception, this fundamental breach of trust, negate 35 years of shared life? Did the man who had abandoned his first child, who had hidden his true identity from her, deserve the chance to remain her husband? I don't know, she said again, more softly this time. I love the man I thought you were. I'm not sure who you really are. I'm still me, Thomas insisted. The name changed, the past changed, but the man you've lived with for 35 years, that's the real me, Carolyn. The person I became after my mistakes. Carolyn studied him, the lined face she knew better than her own, the hands that had held hers through joy and grief, the eyes that their son had inherited. Was it possible to separate the lie from the life they'd built on it? To salvage something genuine from a foundation so fundamentally flawed? Did you meet with Emily? Thomas asked suddenly. You said you met her. What is she like? The question caught Carolyn off guard. There was genuine longing in his voice, a hunger for information about the daughter he had abandoned. She's remarkable, Carolyn said truthfully. Strong, intelligent, compassionate. She's a pediatric nurse, married to an engineering professor, has 2 children of her own, a boy and a girl. Teenagers now. Thomas absorbed this information, his eyes bright with unshed tears. My grandchildren, he whispered. I have grandchildren I've never met. Yes, Carolyn confirmed. Just as Emily has a father she's never really known. Does she hate me? The question was barely audible. Carolyn considered her answer carefully. She's hurt, confused, has spent her life wondering why her father couldn't love her enough to stay. She paused, then decided Thomas deserved to know the full truth. But she said she might be willing to meet you. Someday. Hope flashed across his features, followed quickly by fear. Meet me? After all this time? She's a healer, Thomas. It's her profession and I think her nature. Carolyn moved toward the stairs, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the conversation. We'll talk more tomorrow, about the children, about the party, about our future, whatever that might be. Carolyn, Thomas called as she reached the staircase. I know I don't deserve it, but thank you for not simply walking away after what you discovered, for giving me a chance to explain. She paused, one hand on the banister. 35 years earns you that much at least. Whether it earns you forgiveness, that's something I haven't decided yet. In their bedroom, the room they had shared. For decades, Carolyn prepared for bed alone, her mind racing despite her physical exhaustion. The confrontation had gone much as she'd expected. Thomas had neither denied his past nor offered justifications beyond his own cowardice and ambition. There was remorse there, certainly, but remorse didn't erase the fact that he had built their entire marriage on a foundation of lies. She thought of Emily, of the pain in her eyes when she spoke of the father who had abandoned her, of Catherine, who had raised her sister's child while maintaining a secret that wasn't hers to tell, of Michael and Jessica, who would soon learn that the father they adored had hidden an entire previous life and a sister from them. Damage rippling outward from one man's selfish choices, touching lives across generations and decades. As she slipped into bed, Carolyn heard Thomas moving around downstairs, the clink of glass suggesting he had poured himself a drink, the creak of the den sofa as he settled there rather than joining her upstairs. The physical distance mirrored the emotional chasm that had opened between them. In the darkness, Carolyn allowed herself to cry, for the marriage she had thought was unshakable, for the husband she had believed she knew completely, for the future that now seemed so uncertain. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations with their children, decisions about the anniversary party, the beginning of whatever came next. But tonight, she mourned what was lost. The simple certainty that had underpinned her life for 35 years, now revealed as an illusion built on Thomas's carefully constructed lies. Outside her window, the moon illuminated their backyard, the garden she had tended, the tree Thomas had planted when Michael was born, the swing set now used by their grandchildren. The physical manifestations of their shared life remained solid, unchanged by the revelation of Thomas's past. Perhaps, Carolyn thought as sleep finally began to claim her, there was something to be salvaged from the wreckage of truth. Not the marriage she had believed in, that was gone forever, but perhaps something new, something built on complete honesty, on the complex reality of who Thomas had been and who he had become. Or perhaps not. Perhaps some betrayals were too fundamental to overcome, some lies too central to forgive. Tomorrow would begin the process of discovering which was true for them. Michael arrived first, his expression concerned as Carolyn welcomed him at the door. At 38, he was the spitting image of Thomas, tall and lean with the same thoughtful blue eyes, the same deliberate way of moving through the world. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, embracing her. "Your message sounded serious. Is everything okay with Dad?" "Let's wait for your sister," Carolyn replied, unable to meet his gaze directly. She'd texted both children that morning, asking them to come to the house for an important family discussion. No further explanation, just the request for their presence. Both had responded with immediate concern. Jessica arrived 15 minutes later, her twin 2-year-olds in tow. "Sorry," she apologized, hurrying through the door as the boys darted past her toward their grandmother. "Ryan got called into work and the sitter cancelled. I couldn't find anyone else on short notice." "It's fine," Carolyn assured her, kneeling to embrace her grandsons. "Thomas can watch them in the den while we talk." Jessica raised an eyebrow at this departure from the norm. Her father was usually the first to scoop up the boys, eager for grandpa time. But she didn't comment. In the kitchen, Thomas sat at the table, his posture unnaturally stiff. He hadn't slept in their bed the night before, choosing instead the guest room. The distance felt both painful and necessary as they navigated the shattered landscape of their marriage. "Dad, you look terrible," Jessica said bluntly, studying his drawn face and rumpled shirt. "Are you sick?" Thomas shook his head. "Not sick, no." "Then what's wrong?" Michael asked, looking between his parents with growing alarm. "Mom's cryptic. Message, Dad looking like he hasn't slept in days. What's happening?" Carolyn and Thomas exchanged a glance. They had agreed that morning, in a tense conversation over coffee, that Thomas should be the one to tell their children the truth. His secret, his responsibility to reveal it. "The boys," Thomas said, nodding toward the twins who were exploring the kitchen cabinets. Jessica sighed. "Charlie, Elliot, go with Grandpa to watch cartoons, okay?" "Not Grandpa," Carolyn said quietly. "I'll take them." The correction hung awkwardly in the air. Thomas nodded, accepting this small punishment, the temporary withholding of the grandchildren he adored. Once Carolyn had settled the boys in the den with a cartoon and returned to the kitchen, Thomas took a deep breath and faced his children. "I have something to tell you," he began, his voice steadier than Carolyn had expected. "Something I should have told you and your mother long ago." Michael and Jessica exchanged worried glances. "Dad, you're scaring us," Jessica said. "Whatever it is, just say it." "My name isn't Thomas Hudson," he said simply. "It's Thomas Caldwell. 35 years ago, before I met your mother, I was living in Boston under my real name. I was involved with a woman named Claire Whitman. We had a child together, a daughter named Emily. The stunned silence that followed was profound. Michael stared at his father, as if he'd started speaking in tongues. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "When Claire was diagnosed with terminal cancer, I panicked. After she died, instead of raising our daughter, I ran. Changed my name, moved to Chicago, created a new identity. I met your mother, and the rest you know." Thomas's voice wavered but didn't break. "What you don't know is that I've been living a lie, that you have a half-sister you've never met, that everything I've told you about my past before Chicago was fabricated." "This is a joke, right?" Michael managed, looking to Carolyn for confirmation. "Mom." Carolyn shook her head. "It's not a joke. I only discovered the truth myself a few days ago. I found letters from Claire hidden in the attic. I went to Boston. Met your sister and her aunt who raised her." "You've met her?" Jessica's voice rose in disbelief. "This Emily person?" "Yes," Carolyn confirmed. "She's 43, a pediatric nurse, married with 2 teenage children." "We have cousins?" Michael asked faintly. "And an aunt? A whole family we never knew existed?" "I kept it from all of you," Thomas said. "It's my fault, my deception. Your mother is as much a victim of my lies as you are." Jessica stood abruptly, pacing the kitchen. "I don't understand. You just—" "What? Abandoned your baby? Invented a whole new life? Lied to us for our entire existence?" "Yes," Thomas admitted, his shoulders slumping with the weight of the confession. "Why?" Michael demanded, his expression hardening. "Why would you do something like that?" Thomas explained as he had to Carolyn, his political ambitions, his fear of responsibility, his panicked flight after Claire's death. Neither Michael nor Jessica interrupted, both watching their father with expressions shifting between shock, disgust, and confusion. "So everything you ever told us about your childhood, your parents, your life before Mom, it was all lies?" Jessica asked when he finished. "Yes," Thomas confirmed, "and you have another daughter, our half-sister, who you abandoned when she was a baby." Michael's voice was flat, his typical warmth replaced by a cold anger Carolyn had rarely seen in him. "Yes. The anniversary party," Jessica said suddenly, turning to Carolyn. "It's in 2 days. What are we supposed to do? Celebrate 35 years of... what? Lies?" It was the question Carolyn and Thomas had circled in their morning discussion, reaching no clear answer. The party had been planned for months, a surprise initially, though they had eventually been let in on the secret to help with the guest list. 60 friends and family members expected at the country club Saturday evening to celebrate a marriage that, Carolyn now realized, had been built on a foundation of sand. "We haven't decided," Carolyn admitted. "We wanted to talk to you both first." "Cancel it," Michael said immediately. "How can we possibly celebrate now? People are flying in," Jessica countered. "Aunt Linda and Uncle Paul are already on their way from Florida. We can't just cancel 2 days before." "So what? We pretend everything's fine? Toast to 35 years of Dad's lies?" Michael's voice rose with incredulity. "I don't know," Jessica snapped, tears filling her eyes. "I don't know what we do in this situation. There's no handbook for your father has a secret identity and abandoned his first child." The twins' laughter drifted from the den, the innocent sound a stark contrast to the tension in the kitchen. Carolyn felt a surge of protectiveness. For her grandchildren, yes, but also for her children, now adults, but still vulnerable to the pain their father's deception had caused. "Maybe we should postpone this discussion," she suggested. "Give everyone time to process." Process what, exactly? Michael stood, his chair scraping the floor. "That our entire family history is fake. That Dad is some kind of... I don't even know what to call it. Con artist? Identity thief." "Coward," Thomas supplied quietly. "The word you're looking for is coward." "At least that's honest," Michael said bitterly. Jessica wiped at her tears, visibly trying to regain her composure. "Have you spoken to her? To Emily?" "I have," Carolyn answered. "She's understandably upset, confused. She grew up wondering why her father abandoned her." "Does she want to meet us?" Jessica asked. "Meet him?" She couldn't quite bring herself to call Thomas Dad in that moment. "She indicated she might be open to meeting Thomas someday," Carolyn said carefully. "We didn't discuss the rest of the family." Michael shook his head, pacing now as Jessica had earlier. The siblings had always been physically expressive in their emotions, a trait neither had inherited from their outwardly calm father. "This is insane, completely insane. 40 years of lies and we're just supposed to what? Adjust? Accept it?" "I don't expect immediate forgiveness," Thomas said. "Or perhaps any forgiveness. But you deserve to know the truth." "The truth," Michael repeated sarcastically. "Something you've apparently had a very flexible relationship with, Dad." "Michael," Carolyn cautioned. "No, he's right," Thomas said. "I've lied to all of you for decades. I've betrayed your trust in the most fundamental way. You have every right." "To your anger," Jessica sank back into her chair, the initial shock giving way to a more practical assessment of the situation. "What does this mean legally? Is your marriage even valid, Mum? Are our birth certificates legal? What about the house, your retirement accounts? If Dad's identity is fake..." It was a concern Carolyn had raised with Thomas that morning. He'd assured her that while his original identity change had been essentially fraudulent, the decades of documentation since, tax returns, property deeds, insurance policies, created a legal reality that would likely stand. Still, there would be complications if they chose to address the falsehood officially. "We haven't sorted through all of that yet," Carolyn admitted. "One step at a time." "And what's the next step?" Michael asked, his anger seemingly spent, leaving behind a weary confusion. "Where do we all go from here?" It was the question that had haunted Carolyn since finding the letters. What came next? How did a family recover from a deception this profound? "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I'm still figuring that out myself." Jessica looked at her father, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to process this, to decide what it means for me, for my relationship with you." "Of course," Thomas nodded, pain evident in his expression, but acceptance too. "I'll get the boys," Jessica said, standing. "We need to go home. Think about all this." She hesitated, then added, "About the party. Maybe we should go through with it. Not as a celebration anymore, but as, I don't know, a chance to be together as a family while we figure this out, to present a united front until we decide what comes next." Michael looked like he wanted to object, but ultimately nodded. "Fine. We'll discuss it tomorrow, figure out what to tell people." As Jessica gathered the twins from the den and Michael collected his coat, the physical distance between the family members seemed to mirror the emotional chasm that had opened. Hugs that would normally accompany departures were absent, casual plans to talk later replaced by formal agreements about when to reconnect. When they had gone, Carolyn and Thomas sat in silence at the kitchen table, the weight of their children's reactions settling around them. "That went about as well as could be expected," Carolyn said finally. "They're in shock," Thomas observed. "The anger will come later. More of it anyway." "Yes." Carolyn had seen it in Jessica's eyes as she left. The initial confusion already hardening into something more complex, more painful. Michael's anger had been immediate, but would likely deepen as the reality sank in. "They'll need time." "And you?" Thomas asked cautiously. "Do you need more time as well?" Carolyn considered the question. The past 5 days had been a whirlwind of discovery, investigation, confrontation. She had barely had a moment to truly process what it all meant for her, for them. "Yes," she said finally. "I need time too, to decide what I want, what happens next for us." Thomas nodded, accepting this without protest. Would you prefer if I stayed somewhere else for a while?" The question caught her off guard. Despite everything, the thought of Thomas leaving, of their home empty of his presence, created a sharp pain in her chest. Whatever anger and betrayal she felt, there was still love there too. 35 years of it, not easily set aside. "No," she said after a moment. "Stay. We'll figure this out together, whatever this ends up being." Relief flashed across his face. "Thank you," he said simply. Outside, the April afternoon continued placidly, neighbors walking dogs, children returning from school, the ordinary rhythms of life uninterrupted by the seismic shifts occurring within. Their home. Carolyn found herself envying that normalcy, wondering if her family would ever find its way back to anything resembling it. Probably not, she admitted to herself. Whatever came next, reconciliation, separation, some complex middle ground, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The revelation of Thomas's past had altered the very foundation of their shared history, creating a before and after that couldn't be undone. The question now was whether they could build something new from the wreckage of what Thomas's deception had destroyed, whether the love and life they had shared for 35 years was strong enough to survive the truth that should have been acknowledged from the beginning, to be continued.